Hello and welcome to my session. First, as before, I have some boilerplate slides for you. So just that you remember the licensing. I think you should have saw it all before. But what I'm going to talk about today is the best practices in open source and standards, which is related to the Lighthouse OSS working group of ELISA, which started to evaluate some example projects, and I will tell a little bit more about the evaluation of 2 example projects today. I have some wonderful introduction slides. So who am I? I'm Simone Weiss. Since 1 year, more or less, I'm more active in ELISA. And since the creation date of the Lighthouse OSS last one meeting, I am participating. And so, in this month, and since this month, I'm with Linutronix. So, what is my agenda? So first, I want to, because it's maybe not common to everyone, introduce quickly the goals of the working group and the approach we have chosen, which is then defined with introducing our template for this evaluation. Then I'll talk more about the evaluation of the projects, some just the results, some patterns, some challenges, and also with future work I will conclude then my session. So I have first a question to the audience. What is the number 1 best practice that should be followed in open source development? And I want one person to answer, just anyone. Please feel free. Communication. Post early in communication. And now we already have 2 answers. So thinking. But there are multiple answers. And so the question is, what should be the practices that should all be followed? We had 3 people, 3 answers, and we didn't agree with what is the most important one. So for sure, there are more than just one important, but what all those practices are, this is one goal of the Lighthouse OSS working group. So to give you a bit more background here, so shockingly, open source software is not developed according to aerospace.
No.
I'm not.
Very guest.
Sorry. I don't know. Yeah, I feel the shock, but that's the truth. But aerospace and similar processes are referenced in quality standards, and there I mean not only from the functional safety perspective, but also to have something, not any ASIL or not any SIL level, you're already supposed to follow a certain quality level already, and this normally references processes that are meant for proprietary software development. But nonetheless, I would say the Linux kernel functions more or less. The Xen hypervisor functions more or less very well. So those open source projects have some major quality, and they have arrived to this major quality not just by coincidence, but also by processes. So they have some process in place, but those are not reflected in the standard. And we therefore have a clearly lack of a matching quality standard that fits to the processes as utilized in open source development. So the goals of the working group is therefore to evaluate and document such best practices in open source development and provide a guide on how open source projects can be accessed if they follow a certain process, yes or not. Note, I have some discussion point markers in my slides because I want this to be an interactive session. You can always chime in. I also have tried to collect them again at the end, but please feel always free to chime in. This is not a concluded work, it's more of a progress statement. So what is the approach there? This was already highlighted, I think, by Philip when he introduced the working group, but just we have just to recap it for all that don't know. We first want to determine the status. So what practices do we have? What standards do we have? Where do they match? Where do they maybe not match? And are there any practices that actually increase the quality? I mean, a standard could demand a practice that is not providing any benefit, but nonetheless, this first needs to be determined. then we want to define the best practices. So basically see what we can reuse from standards or from open source development. And there's also the part that we want to evaluate OSS projects to see how well they define those practices and have some certain pilots and see, is this evaluable? Do we gain some insight from there? And this is where I will introduce later the evaluation of Yocto and Xen. And once this is done, we want to create a framework, but this is not worked on through yet. So we are roughly lingering between determining the status and the definition of the practices. And as usual, iterative work. So I said before, we want to determine the status. And for that, we considered a QMS framework that was based on the quality aspects of the ISO 9001. And there are certain areas that are always considered. And I could now just read them through you, but this is just a worksheet, so I can also just open it. So we are extracting relevant areas of the QMS. So we always have a certain area, like maybe risk management, and we try to evaluate what is the goal there, what is to be there, what is to be achieved there. So why is this done? And this is based on QMS. So we have risk management, but also stakeholders, which might be something different in an open source project than in proprietary software, but for sure there may be stakeholders, how resources can be managed, if there are appropriate researchers, then compliance. That is also the process I could apply to. And so areas from a QMS framework are considered, and then we have defined the aspects and created requirements, and you can see that also here on the worksheet. So I'm introducing the worksheet because this is really the work result of the working group here. And this is the approach from the standards. What is there? What do we have? This is evaluated from that perspective. But what about the open source best practices? And we already had Stefan there from who introduced his work that he recently published and considered his work, but also other works. I have linked them here in the slides, and then mapped that in basically both directions. So we have a certain topic and practice from the QMS framework and checked if it's also included in open source best practices, and did then a mapping from the QMS side to the practices side, and also in the other way around. And just to give some notes to things. So this is, of course, the working group, and especially Wendy was very active there. So this is not just my personal work. So shout outs to Wendy there. As you see, we have basically here 3 additional literature considered. Of course, there's more to be considered, but this is one starting point we choose. So I think we're also happy if you have any publication we should for sure include. You can just give proposals as well. Maybe there's something we are missing. So let me now come to a first example, Xen. And as a disclaimer, I knew that Xen before existed. I had nothing to do with it because this is relevant to the evaluation, I think. So from my personal standpoint, I knew it existed. I used it before. I was not involved at all with the community. So a very outside assessment, I would say. I said before that there are certain key requirements, and it's a little bit hard to display, so I had some color coding there. We have some typical points. We had already, I think, yesterday the term of meritocratic leadership. So is the leadership defined on merit? And if you take a look at the Xen governance project, you will governance documentation, you will see that this is clearly the case. So it's vote or based on merit. Is there some transparent decision making? So there, the Xen process was actually very well documented in the governance charter, and it's also done per open so-called lazy consensus, where they just have issues and you can comment on if you agree, if you disagree, but also if you agree. But if nobody actively disagrees, it's to be assumed. So he will not be checked. Okay, do you agree? Because he has not spoken up, and it's a rather well-known, rather good documented, and you can actually find all the evidences of the decisions they have taken in that form on GitHub quite easily, which is outstanding, I would say. So then are there some clearly defined roles? So who is the maintainer and so on? And also this is rather well defined. They have so the Xen project is, of course, not only involving the Xen hypervisor, but also other parts. But for all of the subparts and also the complete project, it's clearly defined. Then what is not so well is that document and keep development process up to date. The process is documented and it's also up to date, but the issue is there are contradictions from older versions that are not marked as outdated, but if you read through it, you clearly understand that this cannot fit together. Then there's a little bit the point of requirements definition for communication and discussion. So there are always they're having regular summits where there can be design sessions to come to certain designs. And the issue there is that the design sessions exist, but of course it has the it's only held in person, so people cannot check it anymore afterwards, and it's hard to evaluate how stringent that is. And the same goes for the community-driven roadmap. Active contributor base. I just did an evaluation based on the Git commits, and we'll show a lot more for that. Then community support channels, I would rate this as good if there are at least one responsive channel, which was the case. So they had mailing lists, they had also Slacks and so on. So at least one responsive channel where you see interaction ongoing, not just people asking. And also the license was not a problem. Then what also is related to the things before are the task and the code ownership and the version control system. Okay, and this is normally not a problem. Most projects, and Xen of course included, just use Git, and the code ownership already is defined if you have clearly assigned roles from the beginning before, so that's not a problem. What is a little bit hard to evaluate is the practice that you should have a modular design and clean interfaces. Why is this hard? What is a clean interface? What is a good modular design? I think this is everybody can spot what's very bad, but what's very good, I think people have different opinions. And so from an outside view, you can see, okay, things seem to be documented, or things that don't seem to be documented, but is it now any good or bad? Is this interface not clean? I thought this was hard to evaluate. Another problem that came up was actually bug tracking. So it is, if you have a mailing list, you have Bugzilla, you have a wiki, you have maybe already additional GitHub. The problem is that you have maybe a process for all of them, but it's not centralized, then it's hard to keep track, and it's not visible if you just look for it in one part, that there might be other bugs that are reported somewhere else. So, and they are also tracked somewhere else. So it's not centralized. It's hard to get an overview. And the problem in Xen was also that there were old Bugzilla instances around, which looked to be used and which were documented to be used, but on other publicly available documentation, it was not. It was documented that they are not available and should not be used anymore. So depending on how well you Google, you might report your bug to nowhere. The public vulnerability handling was done by Xen Security Advisory, so that was also good. And then there is the point of limiting and monitoring dependencies, which, to be frankly, is yellow here because it's rather hard to evaluate from the outside what they do for that, because you don't find anything for that. From maintaining SBOMs, there are clearly SPDX tags on the files, but there is no SBOM to be found per release or whatever. At least I could not find that anywhere publicly available. So we have the other parts of that are rather easy to see. So they have a clean commit history. You can find very easily evidences in the Git. What was notable that there is described issues with the use of unit testing and also with the CI/CD pipelines. They do exist, but I found notes and open conversations that there are issues with respect to scaling and also timeout issues when running the tests apparently on hardware. Again, I looked at it from the outside. Maybe it's resolved already, but then it was not marked. By documentation, we have the part of the user-facing documentation and also the development documentation. But while there is existing documentation, the problem is that there are multiple channels again, like a wiki, like some swing stocks and so on. And if you have multiple things and you document one part there and one part there, and then it's maybe up to date in some places and not up to date in other places. So there was a certain inconsistency. Then there's the last point of securing sustainable funding models. And I can assume that Xen is sustainably funded via the Linux Foundation, but I don't have the notes and I cannot prove it.
That should be there on the, it's not done by the Linux Foundation, it's done by the members of the Xen project. And that is a subtlety, and that's important. So as long as their membership is growing, while everybody's stable, they have funding.
Yeah,
It's diversified funding pool, it's not just one body.
that is more correct, thank you. But it's hard to prove as an outsider if it's covering the current expenses and so on. I can only assume as an outsider. And to give a counterexample, Buildroot is actually giving all the details on how much money they have, what they spend for what and so on, publicly available. You can even see the invoices and so on. It's just a counterexample.
Oh, yeah, no, it's good.
Yeah.
It's the right thing to put out, yeah, good counterexample.
And then monitor and improve bus factors. Okay, yes, and I think this is somehow always a challenge, right? Okay. I have a second example, which is Yocto, which I at least know a little bit more. So it was not unknown to me before, as said in the same session. Also to give this as a similar disclaimer here. And this is again the same point. So the leadership is again quite similar, organized as roles, and it's all well documented. Then transparent decision making. You can relatively well read it up, but it's if you are not really into it, it's also somehow hard to read it up. And this is definitely more structured in Xen, where you can look through the lazy consensus flows easily. And also see points like the clearly defined roles, where relatively easy available on the website, and also the development process. Then requirements definition for communication and discussion is rather hard to prove if there's no formal process for it. So you're looking at it from the outside, or you're trying to assess it, what you find, and you can find maybe snippets of discussion, but there's no direct process like, hey, I want to, there's just no directly documented process for it. I mean, you can basically submit feature requests again via the Bugzilla as it's documented, but to be honest, I didn't find many people who did that, and I'm not sure even if it's still a practice anymore. Yeah, from the computer base, look quite similar-ish to the Xen situation. Community support channels were also more than one reactive channel with mailing list, IRC, and matrix, and the licenses. Self-assigned tasks and code ownership are basically very similar to, if you take a look at it, how it is people are choosing something they want to work on. Nobody's doing it, telling or assigning it. It's, I think, just as an Xen from the part, but I assume that this is rarely an issue in open source projects. That's code ownership. So there are, I would say, subsystems maintainer for different parts, like, and also this is clearly defined, and I had no problems finding it. Modular design and clean interfaces. This is just hard for me to evaluate, and so I think there are different opinions again, and then this is, I think there needs to be some further definition first from the requirement side, so that we are able to evaluate this word really. Version control system, well, okay, again, Git is used, well, backtracking system wise, Bugzilla is used as well, but it's used as the sort of proof, I would say. There are not multiple systems in parallel. So from public vulnerability handling, I mean, in Yocto, you have the case you're pulling in other open source components that might have CVEs, and there is tooling available for that, but there are also reports of vulnerabilities within the Yocto project itself, not from pulled-in open source components, and there is a CPE register for that. And there's also tooling to create SBOMs for the systems you are building with it, in different formats, SPDX-wise, and also in different versions there. So 2.0 and 3.0.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Look back to the views. You say it's modular design and clean interface. So there is a gap, right?
A gap from the steps on how to evaluate. So
It depends on what do you mean by Yocto. Because if you look at the developer manual, right?
Yeah.
So there is a chapter that says understanding and creating layers. That will explain, what you need, how you need to evaluate, what you need to evaluate if you want to create, a new layer. So effectively, if you want to add something, to the build, right? So to your customized build. So isn't that, I mean, what?
Yeah.
Everything for you, yeah.
Like, even the way I understood this, correct me if I'm wrong, we are talking about the design of the software itself. It's not how to use it, but more if the software itself inside is modular, the architecture is well defined.
So we are looking at Yocto, considering all the different, so considering everything that makes the software
Yeah,
components.
which make Yocto, not
Yeah.
Meta, Pokey, whatever, but the Yocto tooling around it. And I think what's interesting about it, it's at the point which you bring up. So we started from the publications and we looked into like what are good practices, what is mentioned in literature, that we do not reinvent the wheel. I mean, it's a thing which we try to target on this. And then if it's mentioned like it's important to have modular design and clean interfaces, it's directly like, yeah, as you say, how can we really judge it? Is it really a factor? Even if it may be a best practice, we can say like, this is a best practice. However, to judge, to figure it out, it's very subjective, or there's no.
Tools that can be run.
The point about your designing clean interfaces is also a point of design philosophy. And if I am following a certain design philosophy of patterns that I think are good practices, there might be other people that have other patterns and good design in mind. So it's quite hard to evaluate what a good design is from an assessment point of view. For sure, there are different views, but if you have not defined what a good design is, just evaluating, is this design good? Is this practically possible? And
There are various tools out there for looking at complexity controls and so forth. And what does it make sense to potentially just do an assessment with certain standard tools? Look at complexity to see if that is a factor or not.
Yeah, you would look into the things like the coupling between the modules, and also that the functions, they don't receive too many arguments. So the a reasonable limit to how much things are calling into each other with how many different things. Let's say. Another criteria could be the presence of architecture. So you at least have a diagram, and this is what is very often missing. You look at the system top down and you find the good blocks. At least that already provides some precursor for, okay, the developers, they looked into the topic of the design.
this point I summarized under developer documentation and took a look there, but yes, could be also a factor there.
There's the chaos project, it's a whole bunch of metrics. It'll be, okay, you're going to apply, that's fine. Get in there. Yeah, I'm just wondering.
Okay. So then we are at the point of quality assurance, and there the outstanding point for Yocto was the part of extensive use of unit testing, because what is a unit there? Is it the unit tests of the software that is incorporated and then able to be tested by a package test, or is it the own developed code where there are some tests? This is only read because it was somehow hard to consider what parts shall be covered there. The rest, from the coding conventions to the pipelines and so on, this was no problem to find. Documentation as well seemed to be quite coherent, and just as for Xen, the funding is handled in the same manner, and yeah, for monitoring and improving bus factors, there actually, I think there are still open job ads to get more, to fully hire a maintainer additionally. But if you have the need to hire one, you obviously have a problem. So at least you need to have some people if you're in the hiring process, but that means you recognize it and you try to mitigate it. But I would do the counter. If you want to hire someone, that needs to be the need for someone to work on it. Therefore, you currently have apparently a gap, but if it's out, then probably you're handling it.
Yeah, I mean, for Yocto especially, it was also the case that there was open discussion showing like this is the amount of work we see. We stated on all this on, I think you also may know about the open seeing open issues, compared to workload, how you can resolve issues. There was an open and transparent communication by Linux Foundation and Yocto project, showing like we need more funding on this, saying like this is the potential financial gap in funding this. We need these kind of contributors, and I think it was also a result that the Sovereign Tech Fund in Germany invested into the Yocto project because they saw this is a critical project where many products rely on, the product development is relying on Yocto, so that's why we finance which can help secure. But I think you're right. And as long as you say we have this, we would like to hire an additional one, it seems to be a gap. Otherwise, we say we don't hire anymore.
This is why it's also yellow and not red, because I mean, clearly it's monitored, but clearly there's still some scope.
Then, as the Yocto had to, there is a little bit of history behind it, and Kate will probably recognize it, a Linux Foundation project moniker. It's there for the reason that Yocto was actually the first collaborative project of the Linux Foundation. And when it was founded, the idea was that all member companies also assign a somehow defined amount of manpower to work on that stuff. Initially, there was one very, very big member with a lot of manpower who would be carrying most of the load, and out fairly well. Times change, projects evolve, and it turned out that this member was not willing to carry all of this load. So we found other members, but those members were just willing to provide funds, not manpower. So for many years, by now we've been in the position where we are financially somewhat stable. So big surprise, most of our money goes into CI/CD pipelines because that thing is huge. If you ever want to see a massive building rig, here it is. But the problem now was that we've got a number of members who just care for their own little thing that they are interested in, and nobody was willing to do the core and the grunt work. And this was essentially raised the bus factor and the workload on the couple of core maintainers that we had that were still willing to do it. And then we are, as you said, just right now in the position to actually solve this problem. So yes, there were jobs open. They are not open anymore. I can't say anything public about it at the moment. I'm just saying they are not open anymore. And we are working on solving the problem. The good news here is that other projects have learned from that. So I've seen other project member charters which say either you throw a lot more money or you assign full-time employees. And I guess that's the one thing we had to suffer in order for others to do that later.
I think the biggest challenge for Yocto, quite frankly, was the governance transition about 6 or 7 years ago. Okay, I think that was a bigger challenge than we have right now. I think right now we're iterative and we're getting more support. I'm way too deep there, so I appreciate the external viewpoint here.
Yeah. Completely agree.
Okay.
I have a question, comment. Is anyone thinking about using this metric on the S-Core project? Because that would be interesting.
Wonderful point for you. We have our target project, so I can tell you what we are currently targeting. And S-Core is there not at the moment, but if you are very interested in S-Core, you are free to evaluate it.
Make a new line and we say S-Core. I say.
Just add it.
So maybe I'd like to, yeah. I think it would be interesting.
I mean, like, one thing to mention is from the diversity of the people in there, there are very few projects which have so many committers. So at least on this point, we're on the safe side. Yeah. So one thing here is we have Yocto in, which is with Xen evaluation. but we also try to not only look in the embedded space, and we also wanted to look into projects which do not directly have safety criticality in mind. And for us, even for Xen, there is a huge user base, and safety is not the only thing. So they care about security. That's makes it attractive. What is the difference so we want to get away. No, we don't want to get away, but we want to have an argument like what are best practices in open source. And for Eclipse S4, this is a project founded by the people who know the process hell of ASPICE, ISO 21434, ISO 26262, and from the beginning, they target to work compliant to ASPICE and other things. Whatever practice they would come up with, and whatever best practice they put in, is an ASPICE, ISO 262, or whatever best practice. It's actually, if we would assess it according to it, maybe later we would do and see like, how does this behave? But if we would put it in our finding of best practice, and so we would create a significant bias in there and basically just say like, evaluating the wrong projects. So Astro would not be in the state where we currently are, a project to evaluate, to identify best practices, because it's not created on best practices from open source. Most contributors in the Eclipse S4 project doing their very first pull request in their life.
To give a different perspective, we are evaluating example projects to find what good practices are out there, and not by reading the standard to see what standards propose, and this is what we would get by going through S4. It could be to get a feeling for what's out in open source as good practices and what is lived by the communities would be contradicted there.
When you're going towards Linux and Zephyr, I did studies on the Linux kernel, gave some academic talks about best practices, and there's various talks that people have given about the practices adopted by Linux in various blogs. So that's data there to be mined, and then I basically said which of the ones from Linux we adopted in Zephyr. So there's some material that's been presented in academic circles on some of this stuff that if you poke me, I can dig up if you think it'll be useful.
Definitely.
But it was things like things that help with contributions are things like a clean maintainer hierarchy, so clear roles, and then the ability to contribute anywhere and not be restricted to where you contribute. These were things that would actually help with adoption. And so, but things like maintainer hierarchies, I think, are something that's getting missing here in terms of roles.
So just one more point, because I wanted to close up on one S4 element of this, and on what you said, Kate, also, and what will come up most likely later. So we already mentioned chaos, but there are other ways. So there's like the OpenSSF scorecards, we have Trustable, and they all also based on metrics, and they come up with ideas, what would be good. And the bridge to ASCOR is also that ASCOR actually has some part where they mention the Trustable software framework for evaluating also existing, where they say, when we come to existing open source projects, we would like to see a methodology which we can apply to get a trust feeling on external components. And therefore, this is far more interested of us. And this was something which we also discussed during one of the past meetings, which said, okay, let's look more also into this side. But let's base it on first on understanding how open source projects work. Established long years, open source projects run the long way of coming to best practices.
Yeah. Yeah. To give you a feeling of, I have written a more detailed evaluation also in the worksheet, and it's linked from the presentation. It's just a little bit hard to display that on the slides, but it's there, of course, with also evidence links and supporting material. Now to the questions, have there been any patterns between just those two projects? And one pattern that it was just always hard to evaluate certain points, but that's not a weakness maybe on the process in the project, but just something that is rather hard to evaluate. But it might be that there are not enough publicly available artifacts to judge that, which don't depend on joining specific in-person events. As mentioned before, there might be very different views on what a good design is. That we have just documented that there should be extensive use of unit testing. And I would say it's, again, a question, what is extensive? There could be very different views. What was, again, not easy to access was the secure sustainable funding. And it was always a challenge for all the projects to improve the bus factor. Though there are actions, it seems to be a common pattern in open source. And what differences I found there, I think I would say the greatest weakness from during assessment for me was the contradiction in docs and partly outdated docs not clearly marked as outdated, and especially with respect to bug reporting. Yeah, and Yocto was less formal on the transparent decision making and the clearly defined roles. The Xen governance charter is very extensive there.
Did you actually go and look at Yocto's governance docs? Yeah, should be fun. Okay. They're pretty clear about how the TSC is formed there and how the other things are there, and that's where the decisions are made.
Yeah, it was still way more extensive in Xen and
Okay, that's cool. Yeah.
transparent to the outside of the
Yeah,
decision.
no, I get, I'm not shot up, I say. It's not, I appreciate the subtlety of your view here. And it's just, it was sort of like, okay, what is sufficient to make it clear out from the outside perspective? It was an interesting aspect to me.
So I had no involvement at all with Xen before, and the decisions were clearer to me as in the Yocto process project where I had some involvement before. So it's even easier from the outside to understand, I would say.
This is an interesting point. I mean, it's just when you show the differences, and also like you have been part of the Yocto community, Xen was new to you, or you know Yocto, you're in the documentation. So do you think that this impact the way how you so point could be just, okay, Xen is completely new for me, so I will just start Googling something, while for Yocto I know where the things are, so I will not search for it, but I just go to it. So you do not even see that there is the outdated Bugzilla somewhere for Yocto, or so it's hard to judge most, like with just from the feeling, like do you see it's makes things easier, harder, it's better to be completely new to it, or it's a mixture, it should be two, something like this from first impression?
I would say if you have no idea at all, it's also very hard to grasp the processes and so on. And a first step could be the outside view, and then if you have your first iteration of findings, speaking with the community, if they have more supporting material that was not there. And so this is what Wendy has actually done with the LLVM community, and she found more supporting artifacts afterwards. I have not done the same yet.
Well.
So some general notes. We need to be more clear what we elevate. For example, we have the Xen project versus the Xen hypervisor, and it was, you say, okay, I evaluate the hypervisor, but then you are going back to the governance, and this is by the Xen project, so you have some clearly defined definition on what to evaluate. So I took the Xen hypervisor and the Xen project, for example, as needed. If this was managed by the Xen process, and we have a high overlap with the baseline from OpenSFF. Like for use of permission licenses, for keeping the development process up to date. And ideally, I think we should perform a mapping, because another good news is that from the X insights, many parts from the OpenSSF scorecard, where we have a good mapping, is evaluated automatically. So if I take for example here now a look at Xen, I can relatively easily evolve. Take a look, for example, at the contributor base, which maps to the active community, for example. this is to be taken with a grain of salt. So if there's something reported to be not so sustainable or not so good, you need to take a double look, because it is just it's just an automated process. So if you're considering I don't know, a diverse contributor base, and then the maintainer adds a sign of always imports, oh, everything is done by one person, and so this is an automated process and to be taken as a grain of salt. But nonetheless gives a good overview, and yeah, I think here you will see that. Yeah, so you see what companies are involved, not only from a membership perspective, but also from a committer perspective. So that's basically all requirements from the OpenSSF scorecard that are already automated. And we either way have a high matching. And where else we have a high matching is the chaos. For example, here I have the funding, and this more or less directly maps to the secure sustainable funding. This is, I would say, one of the next steps. Maybe I would propose that we do a mapping of what we have now for best practices, also to other frameworks as chaos and so.
There's also, it's been around for a while, and I bet the Xen and the other ones are there. It's a best practices badge for security, but that catches a lot of use too. So I don't know if you're aware of that.
Is it on the OpenSSF as well?
Yeah, it's OpenSSF best practices badge. It started up in Core Infrastructure Initiative. And that was the processes for security best practices we actually used as a roadmap in Zephyr to try to improve our security posture for Zephyr. And we actually got gold very quickly, and the Linux kernels got gold as well. I wouldn't be surprised if the others are too, but looking through those practices where the project itself has documented them. And it does have some automated checking to make sure things don't go out of date and do that. So after this, let me know. I've got it on my screen. I'll send it. Actually, just a second.
Just put it to the Discord.
I'm gonna maybe. Well, I'll put it in the chat right
Okay,
now.
that's awesome.
I'll put it in the chat or in the notes. Just so people can see it.
Right. A different question to the audience. Which project is now the better one? Opinions? These all race for Xen? Thinks Yocto is better? Nobody really knows. And this is okay. You have some evaluation, but there's maybe as Kate just mentioned, there's not a scorecard. There's no grade yet given, and this is one of the next steps we also want to take. There's a maturity scale now proposed again, thanks to Wendy, where we want to not only evaluate the process robustness, is the process documented, is it enforced, is there maybe no process at all, but also about the evidence we have. So maybe I know that the requirements are from community discussion, but I have no public artifact that supports it. So it might be very good and robust process, but if there's no evidence, that's also an issue. So we want to have a maturity scale that basically takes those two factors in mind, and this could then looking a little bit like a matrix. So you have no evidence and no established process, then it's of course an absent quality. But if you have a very good independent confidence and also a very good process that is continuously improved, you have of course an excellent point. And then you could have a score per practice, and maybe if you assign a scale to the practices, you could also reach an overall score and then give out a silver, gold, or whatever badge.
So is it like a OSPICE level now?
That is a current proposal. And
Yeah, like it's an open source SPICE level now.
Spice.
The spice must flow.
No, but it's not a SPICE, it's OSPICE. Open source SPICE.
I mean, the point is, we were actually also talking about kind of maturity levels to some extent, because you need some, but you may want some kind of rating. And this is then the second thing. So first we would say, like, what are the practices? And then we would like to also execute this. one project through rate and see if our metrics which we come up are useful. And the whole results should be combined. And maybe one differentiating point is later on that we have this open SSF scorecard, we have Trustable, we have chaos community things. They talk about metrics, they help you to identify community health and everything. But what they all miss is to put this later on into a specification, which serves as a standard, which can be used as an argument for quality management. And if you want to have a quality management argument in form of a standard, you should say, these are the practices, this is the metrics, KPIs, whatever I have, and this is more or less the maturity which I can derive from it. With a certain set of freedom of the practitioner of the standard, but this is something which we saw could make sense, and this will enable others, because currently, if you are in a regulated industry and it's not safety critical, it's not, you need to rely on quality management standards like ASPICE or CMMI or something, while you see that high quality software is deployed in mission critical systems, and that we fully rely on open source, but you are in an industry where you may be not allowed to use an open source mature software component, which would fulfill all this, so it would end up in like a green field here, just because it's not developed according to ASPICE or to something else. And just to fulfill the auditors or settlers need, this wouldn't make sense. But if we say like, if you see version control things, pull request bar, CI/CD things, a lot of these practices are born in open source by open source projects. They are the ones which actually came up with DevOps parts due to their need, due to their experience, limited resource, whatever. They were creative driven, they had the flexibility to innovate. And this is something which we should give back to also like ELISA members, to all the members, to all states, to others, just to say, here is the point. You can base your development on what has been proven and successfully 1,000,000 times, 100,000,000 times deployed components. Right? And this is the goal of the activity at the end.
Yeah.
And we try to get as practical as possible, and then we end up with maturity levels or something.
Yeah, so I just said it's like equivalent of what they are, like this proprietary corporates are doing. They are following it. So like it's an equivalent, but it's like open source that you give a rating out of it. This is, and then deciding on the project, if they are using open source, they could decide this could be, at least there should be as like this rating open source, I can use it in my project.
Yeah, I mean, you could do a criticality assessment on what levels of or how good or the practices and the processes of the open source project needs to be that is allowed to be used in project Y, X, Y, Z.
Exactly.
As you just oh, I need at least ASPICE level blah, you would then say at least I need this and that level, and then you have some decision that is not just that is clearly defined.
Yeah, so for,
In the chat, I pasted the links to the Xen and to the Yocto. That's practically badges. And based on that one, I'd say Yocto's higher quality.
Based on that one.
From this point of view, it sounds like the criteria and like all the metrics would be exactly the same as for proprietary project. But the only thing that is different is methods, how we are achieving the same metrics. Like methods are different, but the criteria, how we try to figure out if this project is good enough or not good enough, is different. So criteria are the same, methods are different.
It's an open result, I would say. It could end up like this, but I'm pretty sure there are best practices in open source which are rarely used in quality audited and assessed projects. Otherwise, I wouldn't have so many moments when I look into open source projects where, for example, automotive people or another industry people make their first pull request.
But it is exactly about the methods. It is not about the criteria that like criteria we are applying to the result. But results should be exactly the same from that is outcoming from open source project or from automotive like proprietary
I
project.
mean, which,
The question is,
if-
like how we are achieving those results. But
yeah, I mean, I agree to, I could agree to have extent, for example, we have not questioned that something like requirements, architecture, testing, and so on, which are typically artifacts which you would see in the V model development, that we don't want to see them here.
the question
The thing is,
to achieve it.
yeah,
The
yeah,
question
exactly.
is how to achieve it. And
Yeah.
we are already discussing that maybe in some specific portion of the steps, we are using different methods for open source products in comparison to proprietary products. For example, for proprietary, it can be easily to force some specific, I don't know, checklists or whatever, but open source, it is not that straightforward.
And this is actually also a positive thing about it, because this makes it applicable to, so you can change your way of developing by maintaining the quality goals which you anyway have in proprietary software. Yeah, so it's the beneficial part of it. But we want the alternative way would also like, and that's maybe the different approach here. You could have started with like what these standards demand and then just find the argument for the measure. And we didn't want to fully concentrate on this because we first would like to see like what is there. But to a certain extent we did.
Yeah, basically it is like about meeting those two parts. So
Yeah.
I mean, we took a look at what is available from aspects and what is matching from OSS practices and what there is. But I mean, we also took a look from the other direction, from the open source practices, because of course there might be that something is additionally needed in open source software or differently needed, or something is maybe saying to be also achieved for or strive for in proprietary software, but that is not considered in the standard. Because if we would just consider the standard, we would bend the standard in a way that it fits. But that might not be an open evaluation that achieves more than just bending and applying, but really caring about what is our best practice, regardless if a standard at the moment demands it or not.
And therefore, most of these two things are where we're currently in. So not concentrating too much on projects which started off with having safety, for example, in mind, which are quality-driven parts, standards driven by industry partners. And the other thing still, we look into these whole part and we look into the project to also identify if what others have written down so far as best practice or whatever, if this is really managed. And I remember like where Wendy said she was going to the LLVM people and they said, oh, SBOM, really? They know what SBOM is, but they said it's not so established for their compiler work to have the SBOM for the compiler as such. It's under license and they have some parts, but it was the work group, the qualification work group in which they are in, they said they have less touch point with SBOM. So like this. This is.
And I have now put on my very last slides. I jumped now through 5 slides because I think we're already 1 minute over.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. But thanks for the input.
Thank you.